The reality is you need to look at what percentage of your household income was allocated to servicing your mortgage, what percentage of your household income was being allocated to servicing your rent. We need affordable housing to have a healthy economy. If we don't have affordable housing, we don't have an economy that works. By virtue of it being the top of that list is more often than not it being a volatile data point. You're not measuring real price growth, you're measuring the volatility in the prices.
We believe every Australian deserves a right to own at the very least 5 investment properties. I'm Adrian Trimboli.
And I'm Frank Ambezi, and welcome to the Invest in You podcast. Kent Lardner, welcome back to the Invest in You podcast. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Frank. I remember the last one. It was a great one. I actually really enjoyed it. I think I told a lot of people about the last one. I said I relaxed. It was great.
Yeah, I think that was a bit more. We're talking about data, metrics, and I guess a lot of the things that you generate in your reports and give to, I guess, the consumers. Today, I wanted to get you back on, talk about something a little bit different. Talk about, we've got an agenda kind of to give people a different perspective of data and how to look at other things and reports and understand data points. And I think other things that we want to talk about, like AI and stuff, so which will be awesome. But I guess we've got a lot of new listeners. So for the people that are listening and they don't know who you are, if you want to explain about your background, what you used to do in the past, because you've got a pretty extraordinary story and you've done some pretty amazing things.
I started out in the late 90s. I had a career before that in a different industry, in the telco industry, rolling out pay TV. But I moved into a business called Housing Loans Insurance Corporation, changed its name to GE Mortgage Insurance. So I'll just call that the LMI phase of my life. That was probably the biggest chapter. And that was fascinating because we went through a big transition in terms of how data was being used and how we were analysing risk. I was in charge of the mortgage operations, underwriting operations, and also the valuation side of it, which really was the starting point of my fascination with automated valuation models, property data risk. Back then, we were still processing valuations through fax. So the first project I looked at was the digitization, in air quotes, moving the fax to an image or a PDF and distributing it that out to the team, because we weren't receiving data through any data packets like you've probably heard of LXI or XML. Don't worry about the acronyms. It's just data coming in from mortgage applicants and valuers in a data format. That didn't really happen until the early 2000s. So from that, in those early days, there were a couple of companies that were doing things in the property data space. Residex was one, Australian Property Monitors was another. And then things really started to kick on with the likes of the launch of realestate.com.au, etc., and everything became digital. And through that, we started to see opportunities in the creation of new products. As a result, GE was really keen on integration, digitization. I was working indirectly for Jack Welch, and Jack gave us a mandate to be much more connected to the banking sector in Australia. We were one of 2 businesses globally in the GE network that had less than 50% e-connectivity. So it was a big issue and a big concern for Jack. And he did swear at me. I won't say the words, but it was a pretty scary meeting. So we had to do a lot of focus on integrating through either CSV data sets or what they call XML, just getting data from the banks. That was fascinating. That led to me going back to school to study statistics, because suddenly now we had data to play with. So GE sponsored me to go back to school, study stats, and I learned how to design automated valuation models. So they sent me to Canada and the US to learn from wise old heads. And so I learned how to design an AVM. Right at that time, when I'd wrapped all of that up and I was ready to launch an automated valuation model product for GE Mortgage Insurance, it became Gemworth, and GE spun off that side of the business. And as a result, they lost interest in doing anything other than LMI. So because of that, coincidentally, at the exact same time, I had a tap on the shoulder from a couple of members of the Ray White family to set up a business called Pricefinder. And we designed the Pricefinder platform. That was really interesting. I'd never done anything really that consumer facing. I'd never done anything in that consumer facing software side of it before. So it was interesting, compelling, and scary, because you're launching a piece of software. You don't know what people are going to think. And we designed an interface that would account for the variance in the data. So if you kind of do any statistical model, you've got the bit that fits and the bit that works, and then you've got the bit that doesn't. They call that the residual, the error. So we built some sliders into an interface to allocate that residual to the price estimate so that we could improve the accuracy of the model. So it became an interactive model price estimation tool. And I didn't understand what UX was, like user experience. I had no idea. I designed the sliders for my benefit, not for the public. Anyway, it turned out that suddenly that software became gamified, which was fascinating. So suddenly I learned what gamification was, and people liked it. And then we expanded the data sets and improved the business and improved a few things, and suddenly it flourished, built up, and we sold that to the Domain Group. In that transition period, I moved over to the competitor, CoreLogic. Was heading up their banking analytics team. So the banking valuations platform, which was my heritage back from those mortgage insurance days. AVM, obviously, that was part of the mix. So I did that for a few years, but then a really interesting opportunity came up. We were approached by a business from China that wanted to emulate the RP data product, but in mainland China. And I just couldn't get over there fast enough. It was so exciting. So awesome. And I underline that word awesome. I know it's an abused word, but when you go to China, if you haven't been there before, you look around, it's so big, it's awesome. And that led to a number of opportunities. It was fantastic. I got to design a model for the largest bank or banks in the world. So designed an AVM to work for China. It was adopted by one of the largest banks there, if not the largest bank in China. I think it's actually the biggest bank in the world. So rolled out an AVM for China, trained the team, spent about a year up there, 18 months all up, to and fro, back and forwards. That didn't go ahead because I didn't want to move my family up there. So the bank that was going to fund it, one of the big Australian banks that bankrolls these types of projects and infrastructure projects, I won't mention who they are, they pulled out because I wasn't going to move my family there. So as a result, I left, focused on the business called Suburb Trends, which is still going now. Through that, I had an early contract. I rebuilt a website called Real Estate View, now called View. And that was interesting because suddenly I learned what SEO was. And that website, when I went and first kicked off the project, had about 400,000 unique visitors per month. And we took that up to about 2.7 million at its peak, just by doing a landing page for every property in the country. So that was another really interesting learning curve for an old guy. So, and then since then, I've been doing a bit of consulting work, but mainly focused on my data business. I run an enterprise data business, and Suburb Trends, which is a website called suburbtrends.com. Do a lot of media work, have a product now called the Rental Pain Index, which is starting to get a lot of media coverage, which is great. And I've got these local area reports that people can come and download for $5 each. So they're a little bit inspired by those magazines, the investment property magazines, but it's a localized version of that. So I'll stop and breathe. There you go. That's my background.
So you've done a whole lot from LMI, AVMs, to working with Jack Walsh. If you don't know who he is, looking up, he's a great entrepreneur, to going to China, working with the Ray Whites as well, creating Pricefinder, 2.7 million views on a website that you've from SEO. So you've done some pretty extraordinary things, which is pretty amazing, big accomplish in itself. And it just shows, I guess, the experience and that you have when it comes to property and analytics, which is quite valuable for people that are listening here today. Because I know a lot of people will get a lot of value from this. If you haven't listened to our last podcast, go back. I can't say what episode number it will be, but if you go at the very beginning, I think it's in the top 10, top 20. And you can understand a little bit more about the intrinsics when it comes to data, where Kent's spoken about that. So this is huge, Kent. I think I want to touch on some of these things, but as well, I want to touch on some of the things that you're doing now. It's a little bit different. So one of the things I think we've spoken about is the drone videos, and having like a bird eye view and having a look at property markets with a drone video. Do you want to talk about some of these things that you've created and that you're giving to the consumer?
Yeah, it's really amazing. I moved my website over to a platform called Shopify. The reason why I did that was to make it easier for people to go to the checkout, but equally Google are showing some favorable results using it. So my SEO is starting to work. The ability for a product to be placed into Shopify and then add a video is as simple as grabbing the URL link for the YouTube video in question and just putting that link in, hitting save, and it's suddenly in a beautiful gallery. And so I thought, hang on a minute, what's the best way for people to truly get a handle on a local region that they may or may not know? Even if they are local, sometimes the perspective you get from a drone video is amazing. And so I went on an exercise of packaging up each of the SA4 statistical area 4 regions, and give or take, there's about 80 on my website. I think there's 88 nationally, but not all of them are relevant. So about 80 of those on the website, and that each of those has a little card, a little link on the homepage. And you open that up, and suddenly you've got a gallery of photos and or videos. And I've done one sweep. I spent 2 days. I swept through each of these and did a search for the main town centres in each of the main suburbs against these SA4s. And it was amazing to see how many drone videos now exist, how many of these aerial images exist in the public domain. And they've been going now for at least 10 years. So some of them are a little bit dated, but I try and get the ones that are more recent. And they are 4K, they're very high resolution, and they're free, and they are amazing. So I've just put those on the website so people could come in and say, look, I don't know about Illawarra region. I'm thinking about buying there. A lot of the coastal regions especially have an abundance of drone videos available because people like doing coastal videos and the licensing issues and whatever. So it's very easy to find a lot of high quality drone content along the coastlines. Less common inland, but still available. So fascinating stuff. What is interesting is that there is a correlation. The statistician in me is coming out. There's a correlation between how beautiful an area is and how many drone videos are available for the area. So that's really.
So this is different, Kent, to like your Google Maps and just going online looking at a satellite image. This is more detailed, more current compared to that.
Yeah, well, there's always, I think, Google Maps. I've got a map on my site as well that also does a satellite map. I think those maps have a very important role to play. So I would consume everything you're able to. So never discount looking at a street map because you can see where the main roads are. Never discount looking at a satellite map because you can see where the green areas are, where the parks are, etc. So you can learn a lot from looking at the Google products or the Mapbox products or any of those. What the drones give you is a very different perspective. You can understand a lot of the architecture. You can understand a lot of the beauty of an area coming in from that angle, which might only be a few hundred meters above the rooftop. So I love looking at drone videos to get a handle on it. Now, a lot of these try and do their best to highlight the positives of an area. So if you're looking to buy, though, I think probably the one call out is just beware that most of the drones are trying to zero in on the positives. you actually want to look at the positives and the negatives. So that's probably the big call out here.
So this is for people that are buying a family home or even an investment. Even if you're not there, probably it alludes to them as well even more, because if you're not there on the ground, you can't see, the streets, you can't see what's on the roof, you can't see the neighbors by just because you're not there present. So this is a great way to solve that issue, I guess, for the people.
True. And so one of my next efforts is to start reaching out to people, especially buyer's agents, and say, hey, if you're aware of any content out there, videos, whether they don't have to be drone videos, if you're aware of quality content on YouTube, send it through and I'll upload it. I'll be in the process of also reaching out to all the drone operators, the licensed drone operators around the country, and say, look, if you upload a YouTube video, please ping me and I'll embed it in these local guides, because I want to create a resource. And these are things that are unlikely to find their way onto realestate.com.au. So, they are already on YouTube, but they're not conveniently packaged by geography. So I thought, I think that there's a space for me to create a valuable asset for people to use regularly, which will also boost my SEO. And there's a commercial objective in me doing it, but these are free services.
Awesome. And I guess that will benefit a lot of people out there trying to do things themselves, as well as the buyer's agents that potentially this will benefit them to help them even more with their analysis too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my objective was, if you're a borderless buyer's agent, you wanted to get a feel for an area, how could I condense that down to a 30 seconds, give you as much understanding of an area? You still need to do the on the boots side of it. But if you're shortlisted a new area that you've not really investigated before because the data process has suddenly highlighted a Capalaba or a Melbourne West somewhere, I wanted to create something that could give you an insight into that area in the fastest possible time.
And all of this is on Suburb Trends?
It is, all from the homepage. So grouped by state are all of the SA4s. From there, you can link through to the individual SA4 page. On that, you've got the aerial, you've got the drone photo, any videos that I can collect, and that's only in its infancy, just starting that exercise of expanding that catalogue. What you've also got is a list of all the suburbs that belong to that SA4, and then you've got a breakdown of the individual SA3s, which is the next tier down, sub-region. There's over 300 of these SA3 sub-regions, so think of it as a building block: SA4, SA3, and down. Within that, I've got a heat map which tells you the next level down again, which is called the SA2. A lot of the time, I prefer to actually give medians, especially vacancy rate data down at that SA2 level, which we can cover in a moment. So you've got this heat map, and then that heat map tells you what suburbs belong to those SA2s. And then another new feature I've added is I've grouped together all of the suburbs per SA3 in a single REA search, realestate.com.au search. So if you pick a sub-region, an SA3, you can click through and instantly have all of the suburbs grouped together in an REA search in price ascending, which means that your ability to search becomes very, very efficient. And there are software products out there that kind of do all sorts of property search, but most of those are paid for products. And I think you've got REA's the number one portal. There's no question about that. And it's an amazing tool. I just don't think a lot of people know how to use it properly. And by grouping together a lot of suburbs under the one SA3, you get a number of benefits. One of them is I can get a handle on how that SA3 market is performing because Suburb Trends already groups the SA3 data together, because I think the SA3 medians is the best way to track price movements, inventory movements, listing movements, and other variables. So you can get a snapshot and an understanding of the SA3. Great. Then you can come through and open up this listings view on REA. It links off my site to REA. And then you can do a price descending, price ascending, whatever. Let's just say we focus on price ascending. The beauty of having multiple suburbs is that you end up with price markers in there. And we don't get to see the price that's in the background that's been placed there by the agent. That's hidden from our view. But when you're doing it this way, you'll see price points, markers as I call them, that give you an indication of the expected price, even though there may not be a clear price displayed on a listing. When you look at a suburb and you do price ascending, you don't get many markers. But when you group the suburbs together, you end up with a lot of price markers. So suddenly now you've got a much better handle on what the agent expected price is. And you still will talk to the agent if you're interested in the property. But we're talking about that 30-second objective. How can I give you the most information in a 30-second window? And that's what my aim is.
So for the people listening, it's going into the website, picking, let's say, an SA level of, let's say, we'll use, say, Ipswich in Brisbane.
Yep.
You've got all the suburbs there. You click on it, it takes you straight to realestate.com, and you've got all the properties listed for sale with a certain price point that you're targeting. And it just makes it quick and easy. But as well, it even shows you the prices for those properties that are on the market that may not have a listing price. And it gives you a ballpark figure of what it could potentially be valued at. Is that correct? Or sold
Well,
for?
it's more of I call it a marker. So 1 in 5 properties, 1 in 10 properties might have a price that's been displayed by the listing agent. But by grouping those suburbs together and then doing the price ascending, you end up with enough markers, air quotes, enough price markers that it falls between 1 million and 1.2. Therefore, I'm thinking that's probably going to be set at about 1.1 at the back end. And I don't get to see that, but through these markers, I get a bit of visibility on it. So the example would be, okay, homepage Queensland, Brisbane East is the SA4. I'm interested in Capalaba because the stats look pretty good at Capalaba at the moment. Click on Capalaba, which is the SA3, and then all of the suburbs of Capalaba will open up. So, for example, I've just, Alexandra Hills, Belmont, I'm reading off a spreadsheet here. Alexandra Hills, Belmont, Birkdale, Capalaba, Chandler, Gumdale, Ransom, Thorndale, and Thornside and Wellington Point would all come up in a single search for you, already grouped on REA.
There you go.
Instantly. And fast and free.
There you go. So for people, go to suburb trends, and you can find everything there. I guess if you ever need help, I guess they can contact you for your website as well, can't they, Kent?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a contact us form. I avoid free consultation. A few people try that on for size, but there is an ability for people to formally book a session with me, pay me some money because I've got to pay for things, and I can spend an hour with you going through everything. And within that consultation, I've got a big spreadsheet, and I include that in the consultation, so you get pretty damn good value.
Awesome. And for the people that are listening, we're talking about SA2, SA3, SA4. That's a level of the search. And I guess, do you want to explain in, I guess, dummy form or dummy language so people understand what that actually means and how to identify what each SA level means?
Yes. Focus on it. It's a standard created by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I'll use the term ABS now. So the ABS realized that they needed a geographical group that was statistically significant, because that's what they do, measure things and measure it properly. If you look at a suburb's really not always going to be statistically significant. You've got a lot of suburbs that have less than 10 sales a year, a lot, So probably at a suburb level, I'm going to argue that probably only about a third of all the suburbs in Australia have enough sales and a distribution of sales, as in, the old bell-shaped curve. Only about a third really behave themselves. So two out of 3 suburbs, when you're looking at medians, are going to throw things at you that can be unreliable. So you need to be very careful to help you understand that. If you look at suburb trends, go to our map. We've done the price distribution for the suburbs. So just go through, and it's called price. I think it's called price segmentation or price distribution. So go to our map, find your suburb, and then the price segments are going to be displayed for you. Look at the shape. It's really important. Look at that shape. And if that's normal distribution, bell-shaped curve, you could say, yeah, okay, I can trust the median, or I can trust the median through time, which is more important. But if that's bimodal, or it's leaning heavily to the left or the right, looks odd, chances are that median is going to bounce around. So if I come back and look at the median price for a suburb with an odd distribution next month, it's going to be up by 10% or down by 10% or up by 20%. That's not growth. That's just a shift in what's selling, because there's compositional bias, they call it. So and the great example are beachside suburbs, right? You get beachside suburbs where all of the most expensive houses, often 2x, 3x the typical house in terms of price, they're all along the coastal strip, along near walking distance to the beach or views of the beach. But what if nobody wants to sell because they're just enjoying their summer days and they're all in their 40s and 50s and they're not at retirement age, etc.? You may go through a period where over a 3-month time period, you may not see any listings along the beach. Nothing. So the only thing listed are stuff that's further in, which could be often 60, 70, 80% of the total stock of a suburb are not the beachside property. So what can happen is a lot of these beachside suburbs can have medians that just jump up and down because of what's listed for sale, not because of true price growth or price depreciation. So you're going to need to be really careful of the composition of what's listed for sale. And, if it's the same balance of beachside and the same balance of non-beachside month on month, and it's always this representative sample of all the sub-segments of the market through time, then great, the median will be fairly reliable. But good luck, that's not reality. So I like to look at price trends zooming right out to the SA3. So let's now talk about these building blocks. These building blocks have been created by the ABS for the same reasons I just gave you, because things like suburbs with a lot of data sets can be unreliable. Their smallest building block is actually a mesh block, but they don't give you, and I think that's about 20 odd houses, give or take. They don't give you census data down to that level because it's a bit too personal. So you'll know what someone's income is, 1 in 20 chance. So they're not going to give you that. But the next building block up is called an SA1, a couple of hundred houses, give or take. So that there's 60 odd thousand. I keep on saying 55,000 because I'm thinking of what it was 2 or 3 census ago, and I'm old. But give or take, say 60,000 of those SA1s, they do tell you all of the census data down to that SA1. And anyone who really understands the volume of data and the richness of the data at the census level, it is phenomenal. So you can get to know income distributions. You could get to know socioeconomic distributions, price, age distributions. You'll know how many houses, freestanding houses, are being rented in the SA1. How many townhouses and row houses are being rented in the SA1. It's got all of that demographic and property-centric data set that you could ever dream of down to the SA1. And then the SA1 aggregates and rolls up into a bigger Lego block called an SA2. Now we're talking, we're getting down to, give or take, I think there's about 3,500. Don't quote me on these exact figures, but let's say we're going from 60,000 to about 3,500 SA2s. Now, in terms of how big these things are now 2 to 3 suburbs big on average. When you're getting close to the city of Melbourne, a lot of them are a 1-to-1 with the suburb. But when you get outskirts, get about 20k out of Melbourne, or get about 25k or 30k out of Sydney or whatever, suddenly they represent 2 or 3 or 4 suburbs. And then when you get into the regional areas, they could represent 10 or 15 suburbs. And there's good reason for that, is these suburbs can be very, very low population centres. So you need to group them together to get enough data to have something measurable and reliable. So that's the SA2. Think of it as a cluster of suburbs that can be less in the more densely populated areas and cities, and more suburbs to group together as you get further out. So that's the SA2. The SA3, there's about 330 of those. The SA2s plug perfectly into the SA3, the SA1 plugs perfectly into the SA2, and so on and so forth. So the SA3s is the Goldilocks for me for measuring price trends, whether that be listings volumes, averages, median prices for houses, median prices for units, inventory levels, vacancy rates, rents, etc. I like the SA3, and I think it gives you a much more smooth result, especially when you're doing a rolling 12-month average. So a shift up or a shift down at the SA3 level, especially when it's a rolling 12-month average, tells you that something's on and you're not jumping at shadows. So I quite like the SA3 for that reason. And then the SA3 plugs into 80 odd SA4s. And those 80 SA4s sit on my homepage. So breaking it down, visit suburbtrends.com. On the homepage by state are the SA4s. Click on an SA4 of interest, e.g. Brisbane East, and that will give you a list of all the SA3s that belong to it on the page. When you open that page, there is a little map called, I think I've called it the heat map. That's an abuse of words, but forgive me. Choropleth, but I can't say that, so I call it a heat map. Open that up, and that will then tell you all the SA2s that belong to that broader SA4 as well. And then when you click on the map, it will have a pop-up, and that'll tell you all the suburbs that belong to the SA2. So you can kind of see how it breaks down, and I'm trying to make it this magical 30-second instant gratification for a site visitor.
So it's like a layer of...
It's all laid down, and the SAs all fit together perfectly like Legos, but suburbs don't. Suburbs are a best fit, and sometimes a little bit of the suburb sits in that SA2, and a little bulk of the suburb might sit in this one. You don't need to worry too much about that, but that's the reality, is because, postcodes are designed, for example, for delivering posts, and LGAs are designed for collecting garbage. So the reality is the statistical areas are designed for statistics. That's how we all should be working.
And what was interesting when you were speaking there, talking about median house price and growth, and it can be a bit misleading. So when we see on some of these other platforms, we're saying, this market's grown by 10% in the last 12 months. Are these accurate data points, or just depends where they're getting their data from, what level of SA level?
Your spidey senses should always kind of kick in when people, especially when you create these lists. So what happens in the media on a weekly basis, almost a daily basis now, it's very easy for somebody to get a list of medians and in a spreadsheet, and then do price change from last month or last quarter or last year, price ascending, price descending, spit it out. There's my media release. There's my news content. Ultra lazy, ultra easy, ultra unreliable. Be very careful. By virtue of it being the top of that list, is more often than not it being a volatile data point. You're not measuring real price growth. You're measuring the volatility in the prices. So that's what that list is telling you. Hey, this is a volatile suburb in most cases. There are exceptions, and the exceptions are the ones that look like a bell-shaped curve that we spoke about a moment ago, where you've got more than, give or take, 40 odd sales a year, and where the prices look like a bell-shaped curve. So if that top 10 list or the top 20 growth list does not support those points, where you've got enough sales and enough reliable sales in a reliable, well-behaved distribution, then ignore the list. Don't get caught up in it.
Is there a certain amount of sales that you need to look for that's like a minimum, or it just depends on the area?
It depends on the distribution, but there's a general rule that I always worked upon in the AVM space. And what I often found is the AVM performance. There's some barking in the background. I apologize. Sorry about that. We've got 3 dogs.
Not at all.
if the AVM performance would often be highly correlated to less than 40 sales. So if a suburb had less than 40 sales, or an SA2 had less than 40 sales, the AVM performance would be significantly lower. Equally, it also misbehaved for land sizes above 1,500 square meters. And that's stuck with me. Now, obviously, those things can change as AVM technologies change, but I think that's a kind of a fundamental principle. If you've got too fewer sample data points, it's going to be a little bit risky.
So what would your price segment be the most accurate way to kind of measure how much a market has shifted in the last, say, 12 months?
I would, if a market, we need to define or underline what is a market. So we'll start there. I like to call a market an SA3. A suburb is a market, but I prefer my personal recommendation is call the SA3 the market, and then zoom out and say it's a sub-component of the market. The suburb is just a sub-component of it. And it can behave quite differently depending on what's selling and who lives there and how rich they are and all those demographic factors and stuff. It could also mean infrastructure can have a big bearing on the overall market, but can have an even bigger impact on the suburb where the train station's going or the light rail's going or where the rubbish chip has been closed down or opened up, whatever. So that's how I like to look at it. Do your broad spectrum market air quotes analysis at the SA3 and then look at the suburbs on their own merits.
Okay. Makes sense. Well, there's a lot of value there. I guess people definitely would have got from that.
I hope so.
What else can have you got going on that website of yours that can help, I guess, the people that are listening here to help them with their search or their property data when it comes to making an informed decision?
Yeah, there's a link called Map, and it's got the charts at an SA3 level all there for you. That's for free. So that's only a 12-month chart. And if you want longer than that, that's where the monetization option comes in. And you can buy something that goes back 24 months. But if you want to kind of see a market level trend, that's done at a suburb level. So it's instant and very quick and very easy to find a suburb. Once you're on that map, you can click between the suburbs as well. Then when we get down to the suburb level itself, that's where the ABS data comes in. And I've got the price segmentation in there from my own data sets. But at the ABS level, I've got the CFA distribution. That will display on a map. So the CFA is at the SA1 in the suburb. And what that is, it's an acronym. I love acronyms. We all love acronyms. Socioeconomic index. F, financial, whatever. Don't worry about it. It's an index. It's a socioeconomic index. And I should have done my homework and answered that more clearly. The CFA index is a 1 to 10 index. And 1 means you're in the top 10% of the state by comparison based on socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And a 10 is the least. Now, there's no reason to say that an area with a 10 can't have as much capital growth and whatnot as a 1. That's a truth. But if I've got the choice between a property that for $700K that's in an area of 2 or 3 or 4 versus a $700,000 property that's in an area of 9 or 10, which one am I going to pick? Which one are you going to pick, right? You are going to be a snob. The snob factor is going to come in because the data's there and the data's available and the government's endorsed it, so I'll use it, right? If it's available to me, I'll use it. So that's the CFA. And the other one we've done is we've looked at the SA1 and we've taken the median of the elevation of it. So you'll find that if you go to a coastal suburb or a lakeside suburb, you can see the low points. And sometimes that can have a bearing. Sometimes it can have a bearing on insurance costs, especially with climate change, whether you believe it or not. The reality is sea surge and a heavy rain. Some of those things are getting worse. So when you think about that, then the low-lying areas are worth consideration. Now, I'm not to say you shouldn't go off and use other risk measurements and looking at flood data and whatnot, which is an interesting point. The data that I include is good, but you also need to understand what I don't cover. Therefore, you should then double down on the things that's not covered in my data set. Don't just jump at that. And I also say, don't ever buy anything without including that valuation. Your last line of defense is the prop valuation. Whether that valuation comes through as part of the mortgage process or you buy one, I don't care. It's your last line of defense. You shouldn't rely on free stuff. You shouldn't rely on any of this stuff without that valuation verification.
Awesome. And so with that, you're saying you're checking if it's in a flood zone. That's something that you don't offer. That's something where you have to go onto a local government.
You go to the local government. I will be adding the LGA links. So back to that, when you get on the SA3 or the SA4 page, all of the local LGA links, the ALGA Association. I've got all the websites, 530 council websites in a database ready to go. That's my next task. That'll be next week. That might be out before the podcast is released.
Oh, so you're releasing a podcast as well?
No, yours. This one.
Oh, no, sorry.
You know what I mean? So what's the date? Oh, I don't know if you want me to mention the date today, but yeah, I'm typically expecting to have by mid-May, I'll have all of the LGA links. So when you pull up a suburb, pull up an area, you'll know what the local council link is.
Okay, there you go. So I think by the time this comes out, that should be all released by then, so that people will be able to get all the information that you've added to that website.
Yes,
should be good. What about? I know we were speaking about earlier before this was the forums and the chats online about property investing, buyers agents, and all sorts of other things. I guess you've got I guess you wanted to kind of talk about these things and shed some light.
I think, there's some amazing insights that are shared there, but there's also groupthink, and you need to discern between the two. So, when there's a pile-on to a certain area, I often get a little bit worried or concerned, especially that the person that's promoting the area may have already purchased a property, therefore there's a vested interest, if you know what I mean. So if I buy a property speculatively in Brownsville, I made that suburb name up, but I've just bought some land with subdividable land in Brownsville. It's in my interest now to create a massive level of frenzy and interest in Brownsville. Totally unethical on my part if I did that, but that's the reality. And I suspect a bit of that going on. So, it's very easy for people to be influenced by very active forum members. And when those forum members aren't being completely transparent and disclosing that whether they have or have not got a vested interest in a suburb, whether they've already bought it for a client in that area, therefore it's in their interest to hype the area, and then get some capital gain quickly, therefore they can say to the world and to their client, I'm great. Without those disclosures, these forums are interesting but not necessarily reliable. And that's not to say everyone, a lot of people are genuinely good, but the risk of this bias is real, and a lot of people don't think of it.
It's interesting you say that, because I was doing research in an area, Whyalla, which you're probably familiar with in South Australia, and I was looking at, because I was just looking at the data, it was like everything was kind of moving in that direction. Low listing levels, the inventory was dropping, we're looking at sales volume was increasing, prices were increasing. There was all these things stacking up, and I was like, okay. So I was doing a lot of research, and I ended up on a forum, and I was seeing all these people talk about it, and there was all these people saying, you should buy there, it's done well, I've bought there, and they're just alluding that they've had 10, 20% growth in the last couple of years. And me, I don't just get sold on what everyone else is saying. So I started calling up town planners, started calling up valuers, started calling up agents in the area and property managers and people on the ground. And I started going all the way back to 1970, and I was looking at what happened in the past to now. And I know it's very resource-based. So it's a mining town.
It is.
Big on steel and iron ore. And so I captured all this data, and I was like, nah, this is something that I would stay away from because of these reasons and from the people I spoke to on the ground. But it was so amazing to see how many people were taking on other people's information, and they're probably running with that and going and buying in these areas.
Oh,
which is pretty
yes.
scary.
Yeah, and I've heard some stories of where that case study I mentioned, the Brownsville case study, was actually a real case study. I don't want to call out the individual, but it was an individual that made a lot of money, set themselves up quite well by buying a number of properties and subdividable properties and then going to town on promoting it. So it's a real story. So I've just just given it a whitewash, but yeah, a very real risk. So I think the biggest concern for a lot of these regions is where the prices detach themselves from the local economy. So what has happened? There's some interesting case studies. It started with COVID. It didn't really start with COVID, but it was really highlighted in COVID. Probably a better way to describe it. A lot of these locations were flooded by people exiting Sydney or exiting Melbourne. So they got 4 or 5 or whatever, several hours out to escape the city. And a lot of these regions saw their inventory levels plummet to artificially low levels, below 2 months of stock. Saw prices jump by 20% plus within a year type thing. And then the metric that became most relevant and interesting to me was how detached the median price was compared to the local household income level. So suddenly then you went from being a market that was expensive but still potentially affordable for a first home buyer to a market that was totally out of reach for a first home buyer in that particular region. And you will pay the price for that because first home buyers will be either thrust into units or into the outer burbs. Okay, that's still the case. But what if everything nearby in that region is now over $1 million? And what if the average person in that area is now having to spend 20 plus years of household income to get in? They're not going to buy there unless they got wealthy parents. And, and so that's fine if your parents are Hollywood actors. But I think there's a lot of these regional families aren't wealthy. So, the only wealth is the house, the house that the family own. So I think we're seeing the reckoning in a lot of these markets playing out now, because like a druggie, you're committed, or you're relying on the flood of surplus wealth coming in from Sydney, or the surplus wealth from Melbourne coming into these markets that might be, Byron or, Surf Coast, wherever. And I think that's a big concern. So a metric that people should be keeping an eye on is affordability, and affordability not just for purchase, which compares one measure of it. And the most easy measure is looking at how many years of household income does it take to cover the cost, or the median multiple, right? And they're measured in years. And, there was a period of time 25, 30 years ago when most of Australia was under 10 years. The average was 5, 6 or 7 years. Now we're talking, we're getting to 10 plus years in most areas. And a lot of the very wealthy areas are up in that 20-year plus mark. But the difference with the real blue chip areas is they're cash markets. They've got a lot of assets. So we're not really basing what we're doing on loan serviceability in a Bellevue Hill in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, because people aren't really worrying about mortgages because they're rich. But I'm saying that those types of metrics that might make sense in a blue chip eastern suburbs Sydney suburb don't necessarily apply to an average suburb with an average income that doesn't have that type of wealth. And that's the problem we face, is we suddenly frogs in boiling water thinking that 15 years of household income plus is okay and normal and acceptable. It's not. And, it's well and truly above the long-term trend. It puts us on all of the wrong lists and radars globally as an unaffordable nation. So it's a concern. And the issue I have is that house growth and capital appreciation is going to really come in the form of speculation, but that speculation can only really be funded through borrowing capacity or wealth. So, borrowing capacity is the issue here. Hard for me to measure wealth because I don't know what wealth is going to pour into a suburb. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know how much it is, and I don't know how to really measure it other than at a local level. But the income we can measure. And if you detach a suburb from local household income and suddenly it becomes 15-year plus, there's a problem because the locals can't afford to buy. And that has an impact on the market long term.
So when you're looking at that, do you want to look at saying 10 times the income is kind of like...
I've kind of pushed the line a little bit. The ideal would have been 10. But, like a frog in boiling water, I'm pushing that line up a little bit in my scoring to 11. But, 10 or less is nice because it means that a local tradie or a local retailer or a local whatever family can get into that market. They can save a deposit, they can service a loan, they can buy a house. That's normal.
It's funny because I remember when my mum purchased the property and I was going back and having a look at data, it was like 5 times the income. But people go, my mum goes, yeah, but it was harder when we had to buy property because interest rates were at 17, 18%. And I was like, okay, yeah, but you bought the house for 100,000. So you put a 10 or 20% deposit and it's 5 times your income. It's not that bad when it's like in some of these areas, like you're saying 10, 15, 20 years, your times your income versus the property price, like that it's pretty crazy when you look at it.
The boomers have been brainwashed to say to their kids and their grandkids that nobody's had it worse than them. You just ignore that crap. The reality is you need to look at what percentage of your household income was allocated to servicing your mortgage, what percentage of your household income was being allocated to servicing your rent. How much were you spending on fuel as a percentage of household income? The only thing that matters is the percentage of household income. What have you got left over to go and buy groceries or go on a holiday? That's the metric that measures. Don't bore me with the other crap because all you're doing is cherry picking the interest rate bit, but you're ignoring all the other variables of interest. What matters is what's in your pocket, what's left in your pocket.
100%. Yeah, well said. Yeah, it's very true. And people get brainwashed by the baby boomers about these sort of things. Buy your own house.
Poor me.
Correct.
Bullshit.
And it's hard. It's hard to buy property now. It's unaffordable, which it can be in some of these areas. Like you talk, you're in a city in the west or east, I should say, in Sydney, and same goes for Melbourne as well. But of course, it's not that unaffordable if you look in certain other areas as well. Of course, if you look around the whole of Australia, there are markets that still are affordable for the millennials as well in Australia.
They're drying up. And that's one of my biggest concerns is people are chasing affordability and pursuing it all over the place. So that whether that be first home buyers, digital nomads, or investors, the concern is where the speculator chases those markets, pursuing capital growth and then buying that property and then getting onto the forum and then promoting the shit out of it to boost the price. And you can kind of see where it all goes is when the whole country is unaffordable, who can afford stuff? And if we end up a country that's only suitable for the wealthy, that's not going to work because somebody does need to pack the shelves at Woolies. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? We need affordable housing to have a healthy economy. If we don't have affordable housing, we don't have an economy that works.
This goes all back to the money printing and what happened during COVID. That's created this gap of the rich and then the poor or the middle class is getting closer to the poor.
I think it started 20 years ago. Actually, I think this problem, and this was a video I watched. It made me just sit and think for a bit, and it was from a guy called Friendly Geordie's comedian, but he highlighted the point and he said this really happened about 20 years ago. He was referencing somebody else, but that's where I found it from. And he said this kind of kicked off when suddenly we changed a number of things in the 90s that kicked on that split between income and house prices. So we need to look back at the source, which was, I think, changes to the capital gains tax and changes to negative gearing and a few other variables, a few other things. And that's the very same time we had a government that said, I don't want to invest in public housing anymore. And I think that was probably the starting point, because that's what the data tells me. And if you're letting the data speak, you go back to say, well, where did things detach? What were the things that happened 25 years ago when the problem really started? And then suddenly it went from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 to where we are now, 10, 11, 12 years of household income. So you need to go back to the true cause of this, and not necessarily and only blame COVID or blame the current government, which is crazy, right? I don't think the current government's doing smart things with them influx of net immigrants. It's just not making any sense at all, because it's totally detached from housing supply. So that's not helping. But equally, we've had 20 years of governments all equally guilty of sticking it to young people.
And it's kind of started, I guess, if you go all the way back 1970, was it 71, when President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard?
That was stupid.
That's when debt was created.
Horrible. So yeah, these are all these things. Now, their problems started to happen back then. You know, you can kind of draw the lines back and say, when was there an inflection point where things truly favoured the wealthy? Well, it was probably back then.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. But let's get back into it, because I know we're going off a bit of a tangent, which has been good. I know we're talking about unaffordable house prices in some of these areas. I guess, what are some other asset classes, because this is a great tie-in, that I guess people can look at that can be a great investment as well? It can be a great home for the time being, but as well, they're still going to get some growth compared to buying a high-rise apartment. Is there anything that you look at your data points that say, okay, this really stacks up?
Well, I've deliberately included in that search, that SA3 search, I've included villas. Now, they may be strata title, but if you do that search, you'll suddenly see properties that you would not otherwise look for, potentially, if you just do a house filter. Now, I like a lot of villas because a lot of them still show up as they show up as a villa, but there's only 2 in the complex. So they're a duplex, but they might be a strata title duplex. And then, you know, it's not that expensive to change the title. That's the class I love, you know. So I found a few of those for a client last week, where we said, hang on a minute, there's only 2 in this complex. This is a duplex. It's not a villa. But on, you know, formally, yes, it's a villa. But there's only 2 there. Or you might find one's got 3 there. That's the stuff I like, especially when they're on large lot sizes. And they will attract the same rent as a house. No question. They will get you the same rent as a house, especially when vacancy rates are low and stock of market's low. So in a tight rental market, a villa is going to give you the same rent as a house. So your yields are going to be phenomenal. But your capital growth is not going to be on par with the house, because you can't do all the same things, right? I get it. But if you could get the title changed, then it's game on. So that would be the asset class that fascinates me at the moment.
That's, yeah, because you've still got the land component. You know, some of these semi duplexes have got maybe 500 square meters of land sometimes, or if not more, maybe.
Or more. I found one that had 4 units on 1,200 square meters down in the Illawarra a few weeks ago. It's like amazing.
Yeah. And let's say you got an individual, they can't buy the whole block, but they can buy a portion of it, but you still got some great land size with that portion. That's something that can be a great investment for a first-time investor that has a tight budget of maybe 300 grand or so.
Yeah, well, the strata, obviously, if you're buying into a strata, it's the strata that own the land. But you know, when you look at it, it's the land bit that's the appreciating variable. Everything else is depreciating. So if you could buy a villa that has a significant land holding per share, that should be considered in the same light as a house in many ways.
100%. Yeah, because you still got that component, which we purchase. I wouldn't say we purchase villas. We've purchased a lot of blocks of units, so duplexes, quadplexes, and triplexes, and all sort of things.
Yeah.
And then our investors have got the opportunity to even, you know, sell off individual villas when they feel like they want to, just downsize or pay off some of the debt faster like that, and keep the remaining in their blocks of units that they've got.
There's an interesting to see how many whole blocks of units come up for sale from time to time, and I don't have enough knowledge to say why is that happening, other than it's somebody at a certain age and they don't have anyone to hand it over to, so they're just divesting. If there's another reason behind it, I'd love somebody to educate me. But I'm looking around Mudgee, for example, and right now there's 2 or 3 whole blocks of 8 or 10 or 12 units for sale. Really interesting.
Yeah, it is. Some of the people that own them, you don't know if they were developers that owned them, and then they've owned them for all those years, and then now they've come off to say, "Oh, I need to sell them," and then they've strata them. A lot of them don't have strata. Some of these blocks of units, so and to get that, of course, I think you need to do some work and engineer out there and make it compliant as well. So sometimes they just sell it as one bunch to make it a little bit easier for themselves. But it's great. It can be a great investment. Like you said, the yields are very appealing, especially now high interest rates as well for the investor.
Well, so one of the big concerns I got at the moment is, I build these scorecards on spreadsheets, and it was rather easy for me to be persuaded by the yields that was turning up and are turning up for units right now. So suddenly your units come to bubble to the top, but then you need to pull back and say, well, what are the costs of ownership? What are the strata levies? What are the risks? And then equally, the big one is, what's the long-term risk and the long-term capital growth? And then suddenly you have a different perspective again. And I think everybody's got to remember, what's the long-term capital growth on average of units compared to houses? And by and large, it's about half, right? Depends on where you are. But there's a lot of horror stories that come out of places where people have lost money from units. There's less of those horror stories in houses. Yes, they do exist. But it's not hard for me to go and find a sale history for a unit in the Docklands area in Melbourne and find that person sold it for the same price they bought it for 10 years ago. That's common, not hard to find. Much harder for me to find that for houses. Yes, it happens in remote areas, but by and large, that trade-off of yield needs to be weighed up against the risks for units. And a lot of people are going towards units saying, well, hey, it's under 700K. That's my client's budget. And I'm running out of suburbs. And they're going to units. And I think what that does is that's creating a speculative bubble in a price bracket and in an asset class that's going to possibly come unstuck.
Because you've got no land component. You're just building this big building up, and you're just buying a portion of that apartment or whatever it may be.
And we're going to find that we've got such a chronic shortage of housing that the governments are going to go all out supporting build to rent. They're going to go all out with infill. In New South Wales, we're rezoning around 32, I think it's around 32 train stations, 3 up here in the Hunter. So if you're in a 400-metre radius of those, you're going to find 10-plus story units go up. So my concern is, let's just preface that by saying we need housing supply, we need affordability. So I'm all for what the government's doing, right? I'm not that this is not a discussion of whether the government should do it or not. They should, doing the right thing. This is more about what an investor should look at. And if you're looking at those locations for a unit, for a house, fine. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're buying a unit in those areas thinking you're going to make good coin, there's a risk that it could be Docklands 2.0 or Docklands version 31 if there's 31 stations where this is going to happen. These could all end up, case studies based on the Docklands experience for the last 20 years.
Well, you said, I guess, a golden nugget there. It's great if you're looking in those areas where there's houses and you're buying houses, because that's going to be more scarce land because you're building more of these high rises. So the housing market will start to creep up and increase in value. I'm assuming with with this strategy that the government is doing.
Well, there's a data play here too, where we're fiddling with the numbers. And what I mean by that is the land gets rezoned and the houses in those suburbs jump in value by 200 or 300%. And those measuring house prices don't account for the zoning change. In reality, what we should do is net out new stock from our metrics, our medians. We should net out any dwelling that has a zoning change and don't include them, and then measure. Now, I don't do that, but by and large, if you use the SA3 metric through time, the 20 or 30 houses around the train station don't have a significant impact on the SA3 median. That's another reason why. So if you're looking at a suburb measure, back to our opening 5 minutes, you're going to find the suburbs where these train stations are being rezoned are going to have massive house price appreciation because they've been rezoned, and suddenly the developers are cutting deals, and that flows through to the metrics. So suddenly the medians for these 31, 32 suburbs are going to be the biggest growth suburbs in the country. Guarantee it. And then they'll turn up in the forums and blah, 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 blah. Now, imagine a scenario where you say, well, look at this suburb. It's boomed. This is the best place to get in. I can't afford a house, but hey, I can buy a unit. You can see the risk. So just think it through.
And with that, do you have that data that shows where these locations are that they're changing the rezoning?
The New South Wales government has published it. It's available in a lot of news articles as well. I'll create a report for it. I've got it in mind to create a downloadable PDF and write about what I think is going to happen and make it a news story. And again, I want to preface it by saying I think the government's doing the right thing. We need affordable housing. It's a good thing. I'm just saying, if you're an investor, be careful of rubbery figures. And what this is going to create is rubbery figures.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. And I think people should take that on and listen to that, and not just not hear it and not take it on. So a lot of value there. I know we've been coming up to over an hour now, so we've been blabbering on, which is good. I want to touch on one thing, I think, and that's AI. I know AI, everyone's scared, can replace jobs, which it will. But at the same time, do you think it's going to have an effect on brokers or real estate agents or buyers agents or in these financial services? Do you reckon there's going to be a bit of a scare to employment?
If there's a big if it stops hallucinating. So hallucination is a lovely, friendly name given to stuffing up. And if you use ChatGPT-4 or any of these models regularly, you will find it makes some significant errors. I'm finding personally how I use it. I'll talk about how I use it. I give it all the clear set of instructions, and it knows its role when it works with me. I give it data, and it knows not to go and randomly grab data from online. So the only data it's allowed to use is the data I give it, and its role is to act as a journalist. So it's a journalist working for me with the data I give it. That's its role. And its hallucination and error rates are very marginal. It still does some things I'm not happy with, but I'm QA checking it as we go. So it's no different to me having a junior journalist working for me all day long for $20 a month, but I've got to check the work that they create. I would argue that there's going to be a number of industries where what I just said is going to be the first and is currently the biggest impact. Impact on a number of journalist jobs, impact on whatever. So where it's the person, as you've heard the saying, it's the person using AI for the next year or two is the biggest risk, because suddenly an individual can produce what 10 used to. So the rise of the solopreneur, or the small business that now suddenly cuts a contract they had with a business because they can in-house it using a GPT model, etc. But the real impact, in my view, won't come into play until that hallucination issue is resolved, because you will always need the QA check. Without the QA check, you can't cut it loose and let it replace humans at scale. So it's always going to be governed. At the moment, it's going to be governed by, the scale is going to be governed by the QA checker in terms of applying constraints and linear programming models, as they called it. So you do have a constraint. What's the output of the GPT plus the QA checker is the equation or the model that we're looking at, and when we're comparing that to the labor impact. As hallucinations get less, the reliance on the QA checker becomes significantly lower. That constraint gets removed, and suddenly our outputs go up. So there are a number of industries. I did an analysis of I think it's 40 odd different industry categories, and then overlaid that against suburbs in the country. And then I overlaid that to say what AI is likely to reproduce or replace in terms of labor by industry, and converted that to a potential impact and a risk at a suburb level. I did that about 18 months ago. So things have probably changed since then. But what's of interest is if say ChatGPT 5 comes out and it does deal with the bulk of the hallucination issues, then there are going to be very, very large sectors of the economy at risk, which then translates to local property market risk, especially where you've got a concentration of people that might work in insurance, or a big concentration of people who might work in finance, or a big concentration of people who might work in media and creative, that could all be replaced by a magnitude of 50% very quickly within the release of a ChatGPT 5. So I think we're at a very risky tipping point. I think we've exploited and understand the limitations of GPT-4 today. We understand that you need to have a QA checker on it today. Yes, there's still plenty of room for it to take further jobs today, because a lot of people are still learning what it does. And a lot of earlier adopters haven't shared their knowledge. They're just busy, right? They're not sharing their knowledge with other businesses. And you've got a lot of boomers. Let's pick on boomers for a minute. A lot of boomers, you just don't focus on it. They love AI, but they think it's magical. Hey, let's just replace 50 people, or let's just do this, and let's magically connect to 50 different websites and reproduce what this analyst used to do, and without any thought to understanding of hallucinations and limitations. They just think it's magic. Good on you, boomers. So there's a lot of people who just don't understand what it is and what it isn't. They think it's magic. They appoint a consultant that blows hot wind up their backside about the magic of AI, and it's not. It's just a piece of software. I think they were getting close to it being less of a piece of software and being something somewhat magical, potentially in the next few years. It's not there yet. And so it'd be interested to see what ChatGPT 5 does and how much that's going to creep in, but it's still going to be constrained by people rolling it out, people explaining what it can do, implementing it in industry. That's the constraint for the next few years, not the technology, but the humans implementing that technology.
And that, like you said, in the next few years, that's something that could be at risk.
I think there are a number of sectors at significant risk, especially if you're already in a sector that's a high-risk sector that's being marginalized already. I think mainstream media is getting a lot of its revenue being carved out of it and moved into social media. So that's interesting. But then there's swings and merry-go-rounds, because AI is actually having an inverse, a very interesting impact on social media, because the AI chatbots are making it a very impersonal, rubbish experience. So a lot of people are starting to say, you know what, social media, I'm over it because it's junk. So I think it's going to be interesting, because that's now having there's a bit of a resurgence in direct mail. So analog could come back and have a bit of a fun time again. There's nothing to say that people might return to magazines and newspapers because they love that analog tactile experience, because the online experience for many is getting worse. But talking about the AI bit specifically, I think I'm fascinated by the avatar, the ability for it to be trained on my voice, the ability for it to be trained on my ugly head, but then take the content that I create through my existing process. I QA check it, feed it to it, and it generates a video on YouTube. Imagine a scenario where I could do this today, but imagine a scenario where suddenly I could produce 5 or 6 hours of video content per day on my property data sets and my suburb trends data sets. That's a reality. I just haven't done it. And back to my earlier point, the constraint is not the technology, it's the rollout, it's the implementation of the human to put it into place.
That'll be crazy. It's kind of that's starting to happen, but I've seen there's some scams going on, that there's AI creating these bots that are, well, these bots creating these videos, and it's taking other people's voices and making out it's them and doing all sorts of scams and things like that, which is pretty crazy.
Well, it's end time stuff, right? It's you know, the false prophet. You know, if depending on if you're religious or not, but you know, this is all Bible prophecy stuff going on, and you're going to be flooded by a lot of false prophets, and I kind of think that's what's happening.
Yeah, I agree with you there. But Kent, it's been a pleasure. I think we've given a lot of insights. We've talked about a whole bunch of things. I think a lot of the majority of the listeners today will definitely get some value from this. I recommend listening to it again, because there was just so much things we were talking about, from going into villas and buying, villas, or looking at drones, talking about SA levels, understanding how to, do a quick search through your website at Suburb Trends. So for the listeners, go to Suburb Trends, have a look at Kent's website. He's got a lot there to offer. Can help you. I use it. I'm an advocate. I use it myself, and I guarantee you'll get a lot of value from, his website. But Kent, do you have anything else that you want to mention to the listeners today?
No, I think that's important. I think, when you're looking at data sets like my website, probably the one thing I'd say is understand what I do, understand what I don't do. Make sure you understand the things I'm not talking about, that I'm not measuring. Understand that scores have their limitations. Understand that they only look at certain data sets, and when you aggregate data sets into a single score, you lose a lot. So just know what you're dealing with. I create a score. I do a rating 1 to 5. Just know that it's just a general guide, because a lot of people get drawn into these because the visuals of things can look pretty. So this is probably the biggest thing I've got. And it's akin to the prophecy issue that we just mentioned, is that when you present something really beautifully, it looks more trustworthy. And I'm just going to call out here, as I've rolled out a 1 to 5 star rating, and it looks beautiful. But just understand, these data points have their limitations. They're just guides. Do your homework and always use a valuer before you jump.
Well said. Well, thanks, Ken. I think we'll get you on in probably a few months from now, and get you back on and talk about something else that you've evolved or created. And I think which you've always got something in the pipeline, so which will be good, and we'll have you back on.
Thank you, Frank. I really enjoyed this one as much as I did the last one.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.